Our next speaker is Mark Page, Training Coordinator Honeybees for New South Wales DPI, and he's going to talk to us about the Varroa response and the impacts on native beekeeping.
Mark Page, Honeybee Education Coordinator, New South Wales DPI and Takal College, talking here on native bees. So there are approximately 1,700 species of native bees across Australia. The majority of these bees are solitary, and there are 11 species that are social or our stingless bees. One of our solitary bees is the ground nesting teddy bear bee, a beautiful bee, big and hairy, hence teddy bear. You just want to give it a cuddle. Another one is often seen in our gardens is the blue banded bee, again a ground nesting bee and a solitary bee. More of our solitary bees are your Nemea species, again ground nesting, and a lot of our ground nesting bees will have at times communal behaviour where their nesting site will be utilised by several female bees. And of course we have the cuckoo bees. This is a domino cuckoo bee here, that being a cuckoo uses the nest tunnels of other solitary bee species. Again, our carpenter bees, beautiful big bee, the great carpenter bee, hearing buzzing through the bush, nests in timber, so drilling a hole and tunnelling down. They will often use your grass tree stalks, your banksias, things like that, casuarinas, and being a carpenter bee, that's where it comes from, is because of their ability to tunnel using their mandibles. Others in the solitary bee species are our resin bees, our reed bees, and our leafcutter bees. So our leafcutter bees, often people will say, I saw a bee in my garden and it had a big green belly. So this is possibly a leafcutter bee, and it's using its mandibles, cut that half moon shape out of a leaf, and is carrying it back to where it's nesting. Wonderful creatures. So with solitary bees, there are some things we can do in habitat creation. We can do the blocks with drilled holes, we can do the lantana, we can use bamboo. Importantly, that we create the right length, especially in your bamboos and drilling of holes and things like that. It is said that less than 70 millimetres long is not as popular, and you're looking at 5 to 8 mil holes with a length of around 120 plus millimetres is probably what is accepted by most of our solitary bee species, including our resin bees, our reed bees. So the other thing we look at, we could create, resources or pollen and nectar for our native bees in our garden. So plantings there, there's a lot of good material out there in publications that will give you indicators of which might be best. Not every plant that flowers has a pollen or a nectar resource that may be utilised by our native bees, but do some research there. Lots of good information on what is good to plant. So our social bees, as I said earlier, there's around 11 species. The common species for us here with the New South Wales focus is your Tetragonula carbonaria and your Tetragonula ostroplebia. Now the location or the natural or geographical range, we generally say north of the Newcastle area, I say around Port Macquarie, is possibly good for ostroplebia, and south of Port Macquarie area or Newcastle area is probably more suited to your Tetragonula carbonaria. So their natural or geographical range, they kind of extend from up into Queensland, the temperate areas, which really suits them. But once we start coming down below Port Macquarie, it generally tapers off, running down the coastal strip to around Bega. So locating these guys in a hive outside of their geographical range, there's a high likelihood that they may not survive. So be cautious of that one, do a little bit of research there. So the keeping of social bees. So a keeper of social bees, like an apiarist, coming from Apis mellifera, you're a meliponist from the Meliponidae. So one thing to think about in keeping social bees is the hive construction, especially when depending on where your location is. So perhaps thicker wall structures and things like that might suit them more for the hot and cold. Location is important. We often look at things and go, well, I think that'll be the best place for these bees, but we need to do a little bit more research there because they are affected by really hot conditions and can be affected by very cold conditions. So our location is most important. Do a little bit of research if you're buying bees and locating them on your property. So keeping social bees, so conditions. So most importantly that we're aware of what's going on around us. What are the bees doing? You know, are they bringing in pollen? And similar to the European honeybee, you can watch your native bees at the entrance and you will see them coming back with extended abdomens, which usually means they're full of nectar. So available resource, these guys generally will only forage around 500 metres from their hive, so they're not able to do great treks similar to the European honeybee. So it is important to kind of be aware of your environment around you, what the bees are doing, especially in regard to drought that impacts. And I know in my area we are heading into drought, so I will not split my hive this year. There's some cautions you need to think about. Obviously fire can take out a lot of the resource for, in some cases, many years. And extreme cold or very cold conditions where the bees actually can't get out to fly to forage also can impact. So increasing hives. So hive splits need to be a little bit cautious. I keep my bees around the mid-north coast, and unlike the subtropical areas up into Queensland or north of kind of Port Macquarie, Mackay, we don't seem to have the conditions that are great for doing a yearly split. So we need to be very cautious on what we're doing. We can always open a hive and decide that it's not strong enough, and so we can put it back together. Doing a split without considering some of these things or the upcoming conditions, if we're going into drought, could possibly see you lose both sides of that split, which is not great for you and certainly not great for the bees. So think about our temperature and climate differences. So much, a great difference between, the Queensland, New South Wales border down to the Bega area. So we need to consider those if we're looking at splitting our hives and make sure we have a strong hive that we're going to split from. So pest and disease, like most things we keep, there are issues at times with pests. So one of the pests of native bees is the syrphid fly, really taping our joints after splits and keeping it so that fly can't deposit an egg there between the joints, which will hatch and then crawl in and get involved in infest the hive. Another one is the forward fly, which again will impact on bees, especially after fresh splits or weakened colonies. Your Bembex wasp, which hovers at the front, is generally taking male bees, and I have actually witnessed them grab a bee, drop it, come back to then grab another bee, so the thought is there that it's picked a female, worked it out and dropped it and gone back to take a drone. So the way things evolve with each other is pretty smart stuff at times. And at times we are impacted by the small hive beetles, so doing a new split and protecting that entrance with a reduced entrance or a plug of propolis is often a good idea. One of the diseases discovered by Dr. Jenny Shanks is Shanks disease. It is a brood disease, a bacterial disease. It has been discovered, but I have not seen great impacts at this point in time. A common thing with native bees is what we call a fighting swarm. So it can be quite horrific when you look out and your bees are clouding and they're locking together and dropping to the ground with only one flying away and the other one deceased. This generally is a takeover or maybe a takeover, so the stronger colony will survive and either maintain that home or the colony that's come in to fight with them will take it over. Now we've had a few things about the response impacts on native bees. I've certainly inspected colonies through the Raymond Terrace and the Heatherbray area, and colonies that we keep here at Tokal and colonies at Patterson. At this point in time, these guys have not been affected. They're flying well, everything's going well for them, although we are heading into a bit of a dry period, so we'll see what happens there. As to our other native species, we have not seen any impacts, and possibly because, you know, for myself, I've been out a bit more and looking for European honeybees on resource, and I've seen certainly plenty of our native bee species foraging, so I think there's been very, very little impact on our native bee species, which is great. So pollination, this is another great thing about native bees. They are not the only pollinators. You know, there are many native pollinators, but native bees are the cutest. So in your backyard for your vegetables, your citrus and things like that, they are great. There is commercial advancement in pollination using your stingless or social bees, especially in your macadamias, your avocados and your berry production. And if you're encouraging native bees, you're encouraging beneficial insects in your garden, which will be other pollinators, moths, wasps, other bees, and flies, things like that. Honey harvesting. So there's a couple of methods in honey harvesting. The early methods were honey supers, where you punch them with nails and strain. Can get a little bit of pollen and a bit of resin contamination there where it tastes a little bit strong. But now there's some very interesting systems coming through with the printed cell system and the centrifugal extraction. Just a couple of cautions with purchasing. There have been people caught out where they're purchasing online. It's a scammer. There's interest in native bees and the scammer jumps in and says, yes, I've got some. You pay a deposit and you don't hear from them again. So be cautious there. Also, people selling fresh splits in areas that will not recover sufficiently to survive. So be cautious of that. Purchase off a reputable supplier. They're available. You know, check things out, talk to people, contact a native bee association, see their recommendations. You know, make sure it's suitable for location. You're possibly not going to take Tetragonial Ostroplebia down to Bega. Not a good idea. Make sure they're from a strong split, you know, and if you're doing one or the other. So if you're going to split it if conditions are suitable, or if you're taking honey, just take the honey, don't split it at the same time. We can weaken our colonies enough that neither side will survive, so be cautious on that one. Conditions, as I say, we're coming into dry periods again. This will impact bees, so become a little bit more aware of what's around you. Of course, you can do garden plantings, and if you're in high residential areas, the bees will generally have access to other garden plantings, which is great. And beekeeping, whether it's European honeybees or native bees, is a learning curve. You know, we do learn from our mistakes. We will make mistakes, but learn from them, improve. Education is a big thing. It's something that we all should get involved in, especially when we're keeping of something. And the Native Bee Associations, become a member there, a local club or group. Obviously, combined learning. You can often hear the mistakes others have made and then not make them yourself.